Imagine the weight of such a cruel act that not only destroys a life but also exposes the depths of prejudice that still haunt our society. A woman, driven by hatred, does something unimaginable to an innocent boy, all because of the color of his skin. But what she didn't know is that this act would change everything. Get ready, because what happens next will challenge everything you believe about justice and redemption. I watched Lucas every day. The park was the stage for his joy, and he always seemed to radiate a light that bothered me in a way I couldn't quite explain. His easy smile, his infectious energy, his black skin contrasting with the green grass. He ran around, played football, shouted with happiness, always surrounded by other kids. But for me, every laugh, every step he took was a reminder that he didn't belong in this place. I grew up in a house where the boundaries were very clear. Us and them, my dad used to say. People like him shouldn't mix with ours. And I believed it. Those words echoed inside me like an absolute truth, even though I'd never understood where that certainty came from. It was an inheritance, a legacy of disdain that I carried without questioning. In my mind, Lucas was an invader. He wasn't part of our world. The park was a place for our kids, and seeing him there, so at ease, made me feel threatened. Like something precious was being corrupted. At first, I tried to ignore him. But he was always there. Every single day. Always laughing, always so happy. With each passing day, my discomfort morphed into something bigger, something darker. It was as if that child was taking something from me, something I didn't even know I had. Anger began to swell, silently, uncontrollably. I avoided thinking about why I felt this way, because maybe, if I thought too much, I'd have to admit the problem wasn't Lucas. It was me. But I couldn't admit that. So, one day, I decided to take action. It was an ordinary afternoon. The sun was setting, and the park was full of kids running about, playing. I had prepared for this moment. I had the packet of drugs in my pocket, something I'd kept for years without knowing why I still had it. I knew that if I slipped it into Lucas's backpack, he'd get caught. The police would take him away, and he wouldn't come back. The park would be ours again. I approached slowly. Lucas was chasing a ball, laughing with his friends. His backpack was on the bench, open and unguarded. My heart was racing, my palms sweaty. I knew what I was about to do was wrong. But somewhere in my mind, that old voice of my father was whispering that it was necessary. That I was protecting what was mine. I crouched down, discreetly. A quick motion. The packet slid into the backpack, and I bolted away as fast as I could, trying to keep my face expressionless. But inside me, a hurricane was brewing. Every step I took away from that park echoed in my chest like a war drum. I glanced back to see if anyone had noticed, and that's when I saw Mrs. Helena. She was there, standing across the street, her eyes locked on me. Mrs. Helena had always been an observant woman. She'd lived in that neighborhood for decades, knowing everything and everyone. Her gaze met mine, and in that instant, I knew. She saw. She knew what I had done. Panic surged within me. My body froze, but my thoughts began racing at a terrifying speed. What would I do now? How could I get out of this? Would she tell someone? Would she report me? My hands trembled. I tried to keep walking as if nothing had happened, but each step felt heavy, pulling me deeper into the abyss I had just created. Mrs. Helena's voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to paralyze me completely. I saw what you did. Those words echoed in my head like a gunshot. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was stare at her, trying to mask the terror that was taking hold of me. Mrs. Helena looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Was it judgment? Disappointment? Or perhaps a mix of all those things? My chest tightened, and fear began to consume me in a way I had never felt before. As time seemed to drag on, something inside me began to crack. The voice that had once justified my actions was now silent. What had I done? I thought I was protecting my community, that by removing Lucas, I would restore the order I had always known. But in that moment, under Mrs. Helena's gaze, the truth began to surface, cruel and undeniable. Lucas was just a child. A child who had never done anything to me. He was innocent, and I was the villain in this story. When the police arrived, my world came crashing down. The officers arrived with the urgency typical of someone who had been alerted that something was wrong. My heart raced so fast that I could barely breathe. The squad car parked by the curb, and two officers stepped out. They seemed out of place among the children still running and playing in the park, oblivious to what was about to happen. But I knew what was coming, and even so, I couldn't move. I stood there, a powerless spectator to my own tragedy. Lucas, carefree, was still playing football, laughing, unaware that his life was about to be turned upside down. The officers approached him, and I saw confusion spread across his face. His laughter was replaced by an expression of uncertainty as he looked around, searching for someone who could explain what was happening. His gaze met mine for a brief second, but he saw nothing. I had already hidden behind a lamppost, watching the scene unfold with my heart in my throat. "We need to take a look at your backpack, lad," one of the officers said, his voice firm but not aggressive. I could see Lucas's hands trembling as he handed over his backpack. He didn't understand, of course. How could he? To him, this was just a misunderstanding. He was just a child, an innocent child. For a moment, I wondered if he was starting to feel what it was like to be looked at as guilty for no reason. And in that moment, a pang of guilt began to pierce me, but I brushed it aside. I couldn't let that weakness take me down now. I had to keep believing I was doing the right thing, didn't I? When the officer opened the backpack and pulled out the packet, the expression on Lucas's face turned to sheer shock. His eyes widened, his mouth slightly open, unable to form words. Confusion turned to fear, and then, for a brief moment, a glimmer of despair shone in his eyes. That was the look of a child who knew his world was about to crumble, and there was nothing he could do. "That's not mine," he shouted, his voice cracking. I swear, that's not mine." The scene was heart-wrenching to watch. I knew he was telling the truth. Everyone knew. But the trap had already been set. Lucas was just a victim of a snare I had, in my ignorance and rage, created. But then, before the officers could do anything else, Mrs. Helena stepped in. And with her came the moment of truth I had feared. "Wait!" Her voice rang out, clear and decisive, slicing through the air like a blade. The officers paused, confused, and Lucas, still breathless and on the verge of tears, looked at the woman with a mix of hope and uncertainty. I shrank back behind the lamppost, trying to become invisible, but I already knew it was all over. "I saw everything," Mrs. Helena said. Her voice didn't tremble, didn't waver. "I saw when that woman," she pointed directly to where I was standing, "put that packet in the boy's backpack." I felt the weight of everyone's gaze upon me, like an overwhelming wall of condemnation. The ground seemed to vanish beneath my feet. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear. But all I could do was stand there, frozen, like a child caught in a devastating lie. The officers turned to me, their faces stern. Lucas looked at me too, and it was in that moment that everything inside me shattered. Lucas's gaze. It wasn't filled with anger, it wasn't filled with hate. It was pain. A pain so deep it cut into my soul like a knife. He didn't understand why I had done that to him. He didn't understand what I gained from destroying his innocence. And, in that moment, I realized I didn't know either. I always thought I was protecting something, my community, my values, the natural order of things. But, faced with that look, all I saw was the extent of my cruelty. Lucas was just a child. A child who had never harmed me. And I had tried to ruin his life. There was no going back. I knew that. The officers approached me. I didn't even try to flee. My legs were weak, my mind a storm of regret and guilt. The handcuffs snapped around my wrists, and I knew that my world, the world I thought I was protecting, had shattered into pieces. As the officers led me to the squad car, I couldn't take my eyes off Lucas. He stood there, unable to speak, unable to cry. He simply watched me with that silent, incomprehensible pain. And then, everything went dark for me. At the station, while I waited, alone in a cold room, the minutes dragged on like a slow punishment. Guilt grew inside me, consuming me from the inside out. I began to revisit every moment, every decision that had led me to this point. Every word from my father, every look I had directed at Lucas, filled with disdain. It all felt distant now, as if it belonged to another life. But the consequences were here, now, crushing me. The truth was simple, raw, and inescapable. The problem had never been Lucas. It had never been the color of his skin, his presence in the park, or his happiness that bothered me. The problem was the hatred I carried, the racism that had allowed me to be blinded, to poison myself. I had allowed myself to believe that this hatred was protecting me, that it justified my actions. But all it did was destroy me. I looked at my hands, the handcuffs still tight around my wrists, and realized I had been trapped long before the police arrived. I was trapped in my own prejudice, in a prison of hate that I had built for myself. And now, I would pay the price. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if Lucas will ever forgive me, if he even should. But one thing I know, I will never forgive myself. The shame, the guilt, the regret, they will follow me for the rest of my life. As I sat in that cold room, the sound of the clock on the wall was the only thing connecting me to reality. Tick. Tock. Time dragged on, but inside me, everything seemed to be collapsing at a much faster pace. With every passing second, a new wave of regret washed over me. Why did I do that? How did I let myself be consumed by so much hatred? The world outside continued, indifferent to the chaos I had created in the life of an innocent child. And now, I was there, paying the price. But the true punishment didn't come from the cuffs on my wrists or the cold walls of the station. It was inside me. It was the crushing weight of guilt that I knew would never fade away. I was called in to give my statement. The officers' questions were straightforward, but I could barely process what they were saying. My words came out automatically, as if I were observing from the outside. By the time the reality of it all sank in, it was too late for any kind of apology. There was no justification that could erase what I had done. With every answer I gave, every detail I recalled, the chasm I had dug for myself only widened. The hatred I had fed my soul had become my own destruction. After hours of interrogation, they left me alone again, It was night. The room was poorly lit, and I felt the darkness slowly engulfing me. I thought of Lucas, probably at home now, trying to understand why all of this had happened. He was so young, and I knew that what I did would leave marks on him for the rest of his life. Even if he wasn't punished, even if justice prevailed in some way, the trauma had already been inflicted. I had stolen his trust in the world, and that guilt was mine to bear. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in my thoughts. All I could see was Lucas's gaze. That look filled with pain, confusion, and, strangely, a lack of hatred. He could have hated me. He should have hated me. But he didn't. What I saw in his eyes was something even worse: disappointment. There was no escaping the truth, and that truth crushed me in a way I could never have imagined. Days passed, and I was released on bail while awaiting trial. Going back home felt surreal. The neighborhood was quiet, different from usual. The children who once ran around the park now avoided me. The looks I received while walking back were heavy, laden with silent condemnation. But no one said a word. Perhaps they knew I was already grappling with something far worse inside me. That night, alone at home, I sat in the living room and looked out the window at the park where it all began. The silence felt more oppressive than ever. For years, I had convinced myself I was protecting something important, something greater than myself. But now, all I saw was a lost woman, consumed by beliefs I had never bothered to question. My father always said things were this way, that the world was divided between us and them. And I had never had the courage to challenge that. Until now. I realized that I had never protected anything. I had merely perpetuated a cycle of hate, blindness, and ignorance. And in doing so, I had destroyed myself. I had become a prisoner of my own prejudice. What I did to Lucas was irreparable. And what remained now was only the emptiness of having caused so much suffering. In the days that followed, I tried to hide from the world. People whispered in the streets. I could feel their stares burning into my skin. It didn't matter what I did from that point on because I had condemned myself in their eyes, and worse, in my own. But what kept me awake at night was the thought of Lucas. A child I had hurt so deeply, simply for existing. I didn't know what I could do to change what I had done or if any kind of redemption was even possible. The apologies felt meaningless. How could I say, "I'm sorry," when I had almost destroyed the life of a boy who didn't deserve any of this? Then one day, I gathered my courage. I walked to Lucas's house. My legs trembled with each step, and my heart raced, threatening to leap from my chest. I knew this was the only right thing to do, even though I didn't know if I would be accepted or if I'd even have the courage to speak. When I arrived at the door, I hesitated for a moment. I knew this conversation wouldn't erase what I had done, but perhaps it was a first step toward truly acknowledging my mistakes, not just to him, but to myself. With trembling fingers, I knocked on the door. Lucas opened the door. His eyes still reflected the pain of those days, but he didn't look away. I took a deep breath. I began, my voice trembling. I came to apologize, Lucas. Nothing I say will change what happened, but I need you to know that I deeply regret it. He looked at me for a moment, and I could see that the innocence that once shone in him was no longer the same. I had stripped that away from him. But what he said next surprised me the most. "I don't hate you. I just don't understand why you did this to me." His words hit me harder than any judgment. There was no way to respond. I didn't have a good explanation. There was no justification that made sense. Lucas then closed the door, and I stood there, realizing that perhaps forgiveness wasn't what I should be seeking. I needed, above all, to understand that there was something much deeper inside me that I needed to confront. The true weight of my punishment would be living with this truth. After Lucas closed the door, I remained there, feeling the weight of my empty words. He had been so direct, so clear. It wasn't hatred that dominated him, but confusion. He simply couldn't understand why I had done that to him. And to be honest, I didn't know either. How could I explain that what guided me was a deeply rooted prejudice I had never questioned until it was too late? I walked back home, each step heavier than the last. The silence of the neighborhood surrounded me. The distant murmur of children playing in the park sounded like a ghostly echo. I sat again in the living room, looking out the window at where it all began. The park, now full of life, seemed like a completely different place. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. Maybe I was finally seeing the world as it truly was, and not through the distorted lens I had carried for so long. The following days passed like a fog, and I wondered if I would ever be able to live without this weight on my conscience. I couldn't change what I had done, but I started to realize that I needed to find a way to change myself. Conversations with my father echoed in my mind. His words, which had long been absolute truths for me, now felt so small, so insignificant. How could I have lived so long without questioning what I had been taught? How could I have caused so much harm based on something that, deep down, never made sense? One day, I sat in front of the mirror and, for the first time, faced my reflection without trying to justify anything. I looked at the woman I was. The woman who had destroyed a part of a child's life, all because of a hatred I never truly understood. What I saw was a broken person. Someone who had spent her whole life believing she was on the right side, but who had, in fact, carried the same poison that had brought me here. I didn't know what the future held. I knew I would face judgment, that society would probably never forgive me. I knew that Lucas, even being so kind, would forever carry the scars of what I had done. But the real battle now was within myself. I needed to rebuild something inside me. Something that had been corroded by years of prejudice and ignorance. There were no shortcuts, no easy redemption. It was a slow and painful process, but I was willing to face it. The first step had been confronting Lucas, but the true path would be facing who I was and, one day, perhaps becoming someone better. Not for forgiveness, not for absolution, but to ensure that I would never again allow hatred to guide my actions. And so, living with the pain I had caused myself, I began my journey of transformation, knowing that the forgiveness I sought wouldn't come from outside. I would need to fight for it within myself. I look back and see a lifetime built on a prejudice that brought me nothing but pain and destruction. What I did to Lucas was unforgivable, and what I have learned since then is something I carry every day. The real problem was never him, never his skin color or his presence in the park. The true poison was within me, in the hatred and ignorance that blinded me. And that blindness almost destroyed an innocent child. This story is proof that prejudice, even when it seems small or silent, can cause unimaginable damage. Lucas was just a child, a soul full of life and joy. But because of my hatred, he lost part of that innocence. And for that, I bear the responsibility of spending the rest of my life trying to understand and combat the evil that once dominated me. If this story made you reflect, don't forget to like and share it with others. Stories like Lucas's happen every day around us, and only when we begin to see the impact of prejudice can we truly change. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, stories that not only highlight the harms of prejudice but also the importance of change. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you were moved by this story, I'm sure you'll enjoy other stories on the channel and the powerful lessons they offer. Follow the channel and continue with us on this journey of reflection and transformation.